If you've been following my work for a while, you'll know that I don't make many narrow-necked vases, yet they're a shape that I've always wanted to try and include in my range of pots. I suppose they're bud vases of sorts, and for the last couple of years, the type of bud vase I've made typically look a little something like this. They're a form essentially without a neck, as the walls themselves slope inward towards an opening. This hides the narrow aperture that keeps the stems or flowers inserted upright. And whilst these shapes have sort of become characteristic within my range of work, they do to some degree lack a sense of elegance, I think, as their side view is just a simple cylinder from top to bottom. Forms with narrow, tall necks aren't something I've made that many of in the past, and truthfully, they're a challenging shape to make, as they require a tremendous amount of collaring in and careful control. Thus, in this week's video, I want to explore making a few of these shapes to see if I can settle on one that I really like. I'm also going to compare them to another bottle vase form you may have seen me make recently, and I'd really love to know which style you prefer. As for the amount of clay I'm using for these, I'm not weighing them, but I imagine they're about £1 or £1.50. The weight's not that important, if I'm being honest. I do understand that from a beginner's perspective, it's useful to know how much you can get out of a piece of clay, but when you become experienced enough, it sort of goes without saying that you should be able to use the whole lump effectively. At the same time, with shapes like this, I'm aware that I might need a bit more material to use in the neck itself, as the last thing I want to do is run out of material when I collar the opening in to form the tool neck. But really, that has more to do with how you manage the piece of clay and how you distribute it as compared to the weight itself. As you become more confident at throwing, and you can picture the shape you want to make in your mind's eye, you begin to understand how you have to allocate the clay in the walls of the piece in order to get to that final point. With this vase, for instance, I'll purposefully throw a cylinder where the walls at the top are left thick on purpose, as this way there's material available to throw into that neck portion. The same goes if you're making something like a moon jar. You have to leave enough material in that initial cylinder to be bellied out into that wide, rounded shape. As if instead you started with a really thin cylinder. As you begin to belly it out, that portion of the pot would just rip and tear, and eventually buckle and collapse. All because you didn't allocate the clay appropriately. It's very common as you're pulling the walls up for the cylinder to flare out towards the top. If I find this is happening, I have to apply a consistent pressure to the outside that essentially constricts the cylinder inward. As if I keep pulling up the walls without correcting this flare, well, then it's only going to become more exaggerated as I work. Thus, after every pull, I collar inward, and I keep my index fingers extended upward, as this keeps the clay above under control. I can also then wrap them around the rim in order to stabilise it. I haven't left it excessively thick, because as I collar in the clay, it inevitably thickens, as the same amount of material now occupies less space, so you don't want to overdo it. The reason I tidy over the outside wall here is that because from this point on, as the opening is constricted, it obviously becomes much harder reaching your hand inside, if not sometimes impossible, without undoing all of the work you've done already by collaring in and refining the top. Essentially, this is a repetitive process of collaring the clay in to thicken the walls. You can then pinch and pull up this thickness, extending the height of the neck. This can then be collared in again to restrict it and thicken the walls, and then it can be pinched and thrown again to create more height. It's a back and forth process, but again it's one that would be much more difficult if there wasn't an adequate amount of clay here to begin with. With the approximate shape roughly there, I can now begin to straighten this top section and to figure out a shape I like. I'm not sure how tall I want this section to be, or how narrow at the top where the rim is, or where the neck meets the shoulder underneath. One of the things you have to be careful about here is not throwing that shoulder portion too thinly, or angle it inward so it slopes down too much, as there is always the risk that this portion could collapse. So if anything, it's better to leave it on the thick side in order to give it stability, as you can always trim it back and thin it out later once the piece is turned leather hard, as opposed to throwing it too thinly to begin with and running into a situation where it could either collapse, or it simply becomes annoying to throw, as it's constantly on the verge of collapsing. In my opinion, I'd rather work on the slightly thicker side and avoid all that. I'm not saying I'm leaving it heavy, but I'm not throwing the walls to the absolute thinnest they could be. With the piece refined to my liking, the pot can then be wired through, and then I clasp dry hands around the outside and very carefully lift the pot away. Due to the narrow opening these pots have, they're actually quite easy to lift off without the shapes deforming, as compared to a pot like a wide bowl or a teapot with a delicate, intricate gallery, for example. I'll be throwing a few more variants to test out a number of other shapes, as I think with pots like this it's all about getting the proportions right. Ultimately, if I do settle on a specific shape, I hope to add it to my range of pots, in much the same way as I have my bud vases already. My first lift when throwing pots isn't really a conventional lift. Rather, I place my hands around the outside and squeeze both upward and inward in the same motion. This means I'm collaring in really for that first lift, and it tends to be something I do more and more when working with larger amounts of clay. I tore off a chunk of clay for this piece, as I wanted this vase to be slightly smaller. I think with many of the vase forms I make, when I'm weighing out the clay, when making them in larger batches, I purposefully use varying weights. This way the finished results alter very slightly in size, which makes forming groups out of these pots a bit more interesting as they vary in size. This one had a shorter neck that was slightly wider towards the body. I don't mind it, but I think there's room to exaggerate that topmost shape. Thus, with this final vase, I'll push the neck further, making it both taller and much more narrow where it meets the body of the vase. This is of course a shape that's harder to throw, but if it creates a more interesting shape, then I don't mind that. And I'll only get faster the more I make of them. I think I much prefer this shape, although I fully understand that turning all of these is going to be a nightmare. Irritatingly, due to how narrow they are, I don't think they're going to fit the chuck I have. This means I'm going to have to turn these in a rather unconventional and very unstable way, so please bear in mind that what I'll be demonstrating isn't the most optimal way of turning pots like this. I also have to apologise, as unfortunately I completely forgot to film this step and a few others in the process of making these vases in landscape. Hence the vertical footage you'll have for this next section. I begin by attaching the vase to the metal wheel head by brushing some slip underneath it. This sticks it in place like glue, provided you don't use too much. And from this point, the outer walls, the shoulder and the neck can all be refined and thinned. Thereafter, these surfaces are scraped over to straighten them, but mainly it's to get rid of any of the more prominent turning marks. I was extremely cautious turning this portion of the neck, as if trimmed too thinly, it would be incredibly easy for this part to simply snap off the body. Now, in an ideal situation, I would have a thinner chuck that this piece could slot into in order to turn its base. I could quickly throw one, dry it and then use it, but I'm fairly confident that I should be able to get away turning the bottom of this just with some large lumps of clay placed around the neck. I use relatively soft clay when I do this, and I can't tell you how careful I'm being pressing this against the neck, as throughout this entire process all it would take is one wrong movement to either bend the neck portion of this, or for the entire vessel just to fall over to one side. You can also see how the neck portion itself is slightly off centre compared to the body, but once flipped upside down and fired, this really subtle discrepancy isn't something you'll ever really notice, unless you place the pot back on a banding wheel and spin it, which, once it's fired, isn't something you'll ever typically do. So that's roughly how I trim these. By the way, this is the other bottle form I've made lately, a link to the making of which I'll leave on screen now and in the description below. I'm not sure which style I prefer yet, and I don't think I'll be able to make that decision until they're fired, as the way the glazes I use coat shapes can change them quite a lot. It can add subtle curves and can create thicker glassy bands in places, essentially changing the forms a lot from what you see here. So don't make your mind up yet on which shape you prefer, as they're still going to change a lot. The next step, as always, is biscuit firing these pots. I do this in my electric kiln, as this way I can fire it overnight when I'm not in the workshop, which just makes things slightly more efficient, as otherwise I'd have to fire them in my gas kiln, which is manually operated. The pots during this firing can touch, and here I've inserted the bottle into a vase, as basically the tighter the pots are packed, the more cost-effective the firings are. The stoneware doesn't get hot enough in this firing for the pots to stick together, which means provided you're careful, it's incredible just how much you can fit inside one of these. The kiln reaches 1000 degrees Celsius during the night, and normally by the following morning it's about 500 degrees. This means I have to wait another day for it to be cool enough to unpack. The next step for these pieces is waxing their bases. This, again, is a step where a chuck could come in handy, but provided I'm light with the brush when applying the wax, it should be fine. The key is not letting the brush sit on the ceramic for too long, as once all the moisture is sapped out of the brush, it can suddenly stick to the clay, pulling it off centre. which in this case I think would probably break the vessel. Sadly, I didn't leave enough space in the bottom of these footwells for glaze to be applied there, hence why I'm coating the entire base. In theory, if you were using thinner glazes, sometimes the process of waxing can actually be hindering, as you can just sponge off the excess easily after the glaze has been applied. But with how thick these feldspathic crackle glazes are, the process of waxing the pots becomes crucial, as it ends up saving me a tremendous amount of time. Now, in order to glaze these, I'm going to dip them, like so, as by quickly dipping it in and then gradually pulling it out, I'm left with a really clean and even layer of glaze on the outside. I could dip the entire vessel in one go, but again, due to the glaze's thickness and how it settles on the object, after it's been submerged and when it's pulled out, I'd have to flip the pot to one side to tip the excess that's inside out. This would likely cause glaze to cascade over the exterior surface, creating thin patches or thick patches that I would then have to tidy up later. So instead, I glaze many of my pots in 2 goes. First the exterior forms, and then the interior forms. And the reason I do it this way round is because this particular glaze, once dried, becomes very powdery and soft. Thus, if I glaze the inside of a piece and then gripped it like I did previously in order to dunk it, there's a really significant chance that I would damage the interior glaze simply from the pressure needed to push it under and pull it out. But if I do it the other way around like this, first the outside and then the inside, it's actually easier to handle the exterior glaze quite gently, as I'm sort of just letting it rest in my hands instead of applying direct pressure to the surface as it's poured out. One important thing to know when glazing pots like this is that you need to leave enough time in between glazing the outside and the inside, or vice versa, as walls of clay are absorbent. And when that initial layer is dipped onto the pot, the clay itself very quickly becomes saturated as the water permeates the body, which this clip demonstrates nicely. I dip this bowl on the outside, and over the course of a minute, the walls very rapidly become saturated like so. If I were to attempt to glaze this piece now, the walls themselves couldn't pull in water, and therefore a much thinner layer of glaze would adhere to these already saturated areas. So, in order for the layers to be even, you have to wait for the clay body to fully dry in between applying glaze to the inside and outside. The next step is tidying up the forms, which again happens a few days later after the glazes have dried out fully. Whilst the surface is mostly even over the entire piece, there's a few larger craters, together with a bit of overlap that flowed over the rim. It's a shame, but it should be relatively easy to tidy up. I tend to use these sharp metal scrapers to do this, and I work that drip back until it's flush with the rest of the surface around it. The most crucial thing here is being careful to not remove too much, as if I scrape too deeply and I don't notice, there'll be a blemish of sorts on the finished fired piece. Normally I'm pretty good at catching these thin spots, and for bigger pots I've actually started shining a light on them from one side, as any accidental thin regions will cast a shadow and create a subtle inward crater, and in those cases, in order to fix them, I simply dab a bunch of new glaze into those divots, wait for it to dry, scrape it flat, and then gently rub over the surface like so. It's worth mentioning though that this approach is not applicable for every type of glaze. For matte glazes especially, it can be more difficult to touch them up without those marks still being present in the finished fired pieces. But this glaze is essentially a type of celadon, and it's quite fluid, which means it moves during the firing, meaning any additions of glaze or touch-ups aren't really noticeable. The final step tidying these up is cleaning over the foot ring, a crucial task that cannot be forgotten, otherwise the pot might stick itself down to the kiln shelf during the reduction firing. This is slow, careful work, really, but it does make a huge difference in the finished objects, in terms of achieving a really neat and even surface. The next step is one of my favourites, and that's packing my Roda KG340 gas kiln ready for a firing. I've never been one to pack kilns with the same pot filling each layer, say a layer of bowls or mugs, for instance. Instead, I always try to squeeze in a variety of forms, and it's a puzzle that I thoroughly enjoy. It's all about trying to squeeze in as many pieces as you possibly can, without any of them actually touching. As with this hotter firing, if the glazes that cover 2 pieces touch, they'll melt and they fuse together, which means you'll probably have to snap them apart post-firing, which is of course a process that ruins both. These reduction firings take about 8 hours from beginning to end, and unlike the electric kiln which is programmable, this one is fired entirely by hand. The temperature is gradually raised, and at 860 degrees Celsius I initiate the reduction atmosphere. By starving the kiln of oxygen, it chemically alters the iron the pots and glazes contain, and it's this that creates the colours that are very characteristic of celadon glazes. the sorts of blues and greens that can be quite difficult in some ways to replicate with an electric kiln, although it's more than just a base level of colour, as there's a bit more depth to them, as some iron ends up bubbling out with that oxygen onto the surface, creating lots of small points of interest in the form of metallic iron dots. There's a subtle speckling, so to speak. And so far, I think these vases are looking good. They're very evenly glazed, and the glass hasn't rounded them out too much, which means they still appear quite angular and sharp and to my liking. They're practically finished, although I will spend a moment just softening the clay on the underside, as the base of this piece, despite being burnished smooth at the leather hard stage, ends up having quite a gritty and rough surface once fired. This is because the stoneware shrinks around the particles of grog that have already been fired that the clay contains. If I didn't get rid of these, if you were to drag this pot across a wooden surface, it would create all kinds of scratches in it. Anyhow, here are the 3 finished pieces. They're both bottles and vases, I suppose, and I know which one I'm immediately drawn to, the piece in the middle. I think the narrowness of its neck gives it a bit more elegance as compared to the other 2, which, comparatively, almost feel a bit stout. Although they are sweet, especially this small white one. Sadly I didn't film it, but a few of the feet on these didn't quite sit flat, so I gave them a proper polish on a diamond pad on my potter's wheel, which yes, does change the colour of the foot ring, but it means it sits perfectly level. I was worried too much glaze would accumulate where the angles changed just underneath the neck, but I actually think it worked really well. Next is my preferred shape. This, for me, is definitely a form I'll continue making. It is the more complex of the 3, but if I invest the time in learning how to throw it quite quickly and repetitively, I'll gain a bit more finesse in terms of my throwing skill, as I did find this piece challenging to throw, as truthfully I never do that much collaring. These also make quite good clubs, I think. And then there's the taller version. This piece has definitely been coated in my favourite glaze of the 3, as it contains more red iron oxide, which is a flux in reduction, and therefore it tends to move over the form a touch more, meaning that the shape underneath shines through better. It also breaks on the sharper edges, creating more interesting bands of colour. Although I hope it's apparent how difficult these are to photograph and film, as their glassy surfaces change so much depending on the light in the workshop. Here are the newest bottles next to the previous iteration you may have seen in a recent video. I think there's a lightness and elegance the versions on the left have, which the piece on the right somewhat lacks, and I can't quite put my finger on it. Perhaps it's the angle of the opening, or maybe it's because the piece on the right is just much more bulbous. Either way, I'd really love to hear your opinion, and maybe the solution is just to make some batches of each, to try and perfect the shape better and iron out some of the kinks they have. Anyway, for me at least, and for the time being, this is the winner. Not that it's a competition, I've just always struggled with these bottle vase forms. And with that, thank you so much for taking your time to watch. It honestly really means a lot, especially if you happen to make it all the way to the very end.